I hope. Okay. So I hope you received the information about how to connect to WooClap. We will use this program for a short survey, which is completely anonymous. So please follow the link that Ariadna sent you to connect, and we will use it in several minutes. Thank you. So I'm delighted to speak about the harmonized approach we introduced in the research on occupational burnout within OmegaNet cost action. And I would like first to discuss with you why it was necessary to do harmonization in occupational burnout research and what should we harmonize. To get some insight regarding this question, I plotted here the yearly number of publications that you can find in PubMed if you use one of the research terms, burnout or burnout written in two ways. As you can see, in 60 years of research, authors, researchers in psychology, in sociology, and also in epidemiology and medicine produced more than 20,000 articles which are available now in PubMed. And as you can see, the increase in the number of publications is exponential, and it is particularly high in the last 5 years. During 2021, we are only in September, we are almost reaching already 2,500 articles published. So we could look together what is published and what are the research topics which authors investigated in this publication. And happily, this work has been done already by two German researchers, Linda Itonster-Heinemann, who published their report in 2017. You have the link to their publication that I highly recommend to read. And they actually plotted the research topics which were investigated in different publications. And as you can see, it is quite heterogeneous in terms of investment according to the topic investigated, and the most of publications were dedicated to the studies of causes and associated factors of occupational burnout. In contrast, as you can see here, the studies on the description of psychological or somatic symptoms which constitute the burnout syndrome are quite few, only 100. And very, very few attempts have been done regarding the diagnostic of this phenomenon, either considering psychometric studies or biomarkers. And the authors concluded that is exactly this very unequal distribution, which is responsible of the vagueness and ambiguity of the concept, which is burnout. So, as you can see, it seems really the contested diagnosis up to now and not clearly identified. And you might know since the beginning of this course that the definition and measurement of the clinical outcome is paramount in every research plan in medical and epidemiological research. And I cited here some examples on how the outcome should be defined in the research plan. And as you can see, there are 3 aspects we should assess. It's conceptual identity of the outcome, its temporal aspects, and also the objective measure the researcher will apply in this research. So if you take the example of incident invasive breast cancer, as the term indicates, we will work on the incidence, and for assessing the outcome, we actually will consult the cancer registry data, where each case is normally confirmed clinically using pathology report and sometimes histological precision. For myocardial infarction, which is acute and transient event, the researcher team will use laboratory test results, for example, for troponin and other cardiac enzymes, for correspondence with the standard clinical definition of the myocardial infarction. So it is very precise. for a disease like psoriasis, which is a chronic and prevalent event, researchers can use the % of body surface area assessment or psoriasis area severity index, etc. But can you tell me now, what is the conceptual definition of burnout, its temporal aspects, and objective measures? So just to make the lecture a little bit interactive, I will switch now to the WooClub survey. So please connect using either the QR code or this link, and we will have 5 questions to see together. Are you all successfully connected? I have only 18 participants, 19 now, and we are 36. So please don't be shy. You will see it's quite fun to do this short survey. And it is also typo friendly and, and very easy to use. So we are 23 connected. Yes.
Irina, maybe I could ask you. So
yes.
I could see my screen and it's written that I should raise your hand. There is no vote in progress at the moment.
Yes, so, because I am waiting that everyone is connected. When we will be here 30, at least 30, I will start the survey.
Okay, thank you. I understood.
Okay, so when we reach 30, we will start. Does it work for everyone? Okay, so let's proceed, and you can also join us in the course of the action. Can you see the first question? What is burnout? So yes, apparently we have 29 participants now. Now I invite you to participate. Just type the word which comes first in your mind. It could be also a sequence of words, whatever, just what is associated burnout with in your understanding. There is no wrong answer on this question. Yes, we have a good progress. Very good. Very, very good. We are more than half now. Once achieved, I will show you directly the answers got. Some more. So we need the last 5 or 4 answers, and then I can validate and display the different options you got. 2 more. There is quite a high heterogeneity in the opinion about the conceptual identity of burnout. And I can already announce to you that there are more than 100 definitions possible for this concept, on which we had no consensus up to recently. We do not know exactly whether we should consider it as a state, as a process, whether it is chronic or acute. And you saw how it was diverse also in your answers. And there is no consensus on how to measure it objectively. There are about 20 patient-reported outcome measures available to measure the burnout. There is also one tool developed in Belgium to assist physicians with its diagnosis. In the Netherlands, it is diagnosed according to criteria for work-related neurasthenia according to ICD-10, or somatoform disorder according to the new ICD-11. And in Belgium, it is diagnosed using criteria for exhaustion disorder. So with this, we also don't have consensus. And this heterogeneity is also very visible in practice. When we started the OmegaNet cost action, we conducted a short survey among 37 OmegaNet participating countries. And we asked in these countries the representative of occupational safety and health whether burnout is listed on their list of occupational diseases and whether it could be recognized as occupational disease and whether it could be compensated as such. And among these 37 countries, you can see here 14 countries listed where the answers on the possibility to acknowledge burnout syndrome was positive. And among these countries, we can see quite a large geographical diversity between Bosnia, Cyprus, Turkey, Portugal, Malta, and Latvia. And actually, Latvia was the only country where occupational burnout is clearly listed on the national list of occupational diseases. Nevertheless, in Denmark, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, it's possible to recognize it as occupational disease, and there are many cases which were compensated according to the survey conducted. So despite the ambivalent status of burnout as a disease according to WHO, particularly in the classification of diseases, it could be, and it is also already recognized as occupational disease in 14 European countries. And heterogeneity in practice is also visible on a smaller scale. Here I want to display the example from Unisanté, where we compared the practices between two departments, Department of Polyclinics with general practitioners and the Department of Occupational Medicine with occupational physicians. And as you can see, general practitioners are much more frequently to prescribe the sick leave to persons in burnout than occupational physicians. They are also much more frequently to prescribe the second consultation, the follow-up consultation closely on their first consultation of burnout diagnosis. They are a quarter to prescribe medication, while no occupational physician prescribes any medication. However, occupational physicians are quite often to contact the employer. And as you can see, they are not very keen to put burnout as a diagnosis, and the reason for this is the absence of consensus upon its definition and diagnosis. And for general practitioners, the most frequently cited reason was the difficulty to establish the link with work. However, the agreement was perfect and obvious on how could we improve the management of burnout when the physicians from the both departments said that we need for it a better definition and clearer diagnostic criteria. So I hope that with this introduction, I convinced you that we have a great matter for harmonization in the research on occupational burnout. And this is probably why occupational burnout, that I abbreviated as OB, was the first outcome proposed for harmonization within OmegaNet cost action. So we created in February 2018 the task group, which was joined by 24 countries with different representatives that you can see here all listed. And we conducted together 3 studies that I will shortly summarize today. The first study was dedicated to the harmonization of occupational burnout definition. So we decided to conduct the systematic review of longitudinal studies, and we consulted 3 large research-based or literature research in base PsycInfo and Medline, and we included 248 articles. All these articles were read, the full text was read after the inclusion, And actually, it was interesting to observe that every study used its own definition of occupational burnout. So we had as much definition as the articles considered in the review. However, these 248 definitions were actually based on 82 reference definitions cited. So it was a sort of modification or adaptation of the original definition cited. And from these 88 definitions, we clearly identified only 11 original definitions. So we plotted these original definitions according to the time of their publication. And as you can see, the first one was published in 1974. And with this publication, the research on burnout started. It was published by Freudenberg, who was an American psychologist and psychiatrist. And as you can see, his definition was cited 5 times in our systematic review between 1993 up to 2017. However, the mostly cited definition, I would say, the monopolized definition was that of Maslar and Jackson. It was published in 1981 in its form and then adapted 2 times in 86 and 96. And what's interesting with this definition that, as you can see, Christina Maslach, the American psychologist and sociologist, first published her definition on one aspect of burnout, which was called a cynism or depersonalization, as she called it later, and it already was released in 1976. Then she adopted it in collaboration with Pines in 80, and then the most famous one was the adaptation of 1981. And why it became the most cited definition, cited 63 times in our selection of articles over a large period of publication, it's because it was based on the tool, the burnout, Maslach burnout inventory, which is actually the most frequently used tool to measure the burnout. The second most popular definition was one published by Schoffeli and Ensman. These are Dutch psychologists. This definition was published much later in 1998. It was cited 12 times in our selection. And actually, this definition corresponds more to the definition concept, what it should be, and describes in terms of symptoms, categorized in 5 categories and 3 layers. So it's quite an important and interesting definition. And we also plotted on this scheme 2 additional definitions, which were not published when we conducted the study yet. It was the 2019 update of Schoffeli, so quite a similar definition, but this time they coordinated with this definition with the release of their tool, which is called Burnout Assessment Tool. And so as Maslach did in 1981. And the second definition produced in Belgium by Belgian psychologists, which is associated to the early detection burnout tool for the physicians. So we just had it like a comparator, external comparator for what was analyzed before. I displayed here the 11 original definition. How should we process their content, understand it to produce a harmonized definition? Because as you can see, they are very different, sometimes are short, sometimes are very developed. So to progress with this work and to understand their content, we decided to conduct a comparative analysis. And the comparative features we considered were 3: population. Was it designed for a particular population? The symptoms, what symptoms it contains, and also the nomological model behind of these concepts. So we did the comparative analysis to understand the content, the comparative, the distinguished features, and then we needed to process with a formal semantic analysis. And as in epidemiology, we are not familiar with this method, we asked the assistance of Francesca Deloro, who is professor in linguistics in the University of Lausanne. So she proposed us a methodology in 3 phases. First, in every definition, we needed to identify every symptoms or concepts or items, we can call it either like this, which occurs 3 times or more. Then we constructed a multi-layered conceptual frame to put these symptoms according to different layers. And then we calculated the effective presence of each item or concept on every level in each definition. So the result was like this. This multi-layer structure or frame was actually organized in 3 layers: psychological level, physical level, and behavioral level. And then we cited the different concepts with their hyponyms and eponyms, as you can see, and counted the number of their occurrence. And to decide which concepts are sufficiently representative, we had to define the cutoff value, which was defined at 7 out of 11, to have them sufficiently present in to construct the harmonized definition. So based on this method, we produced this definition statement, which is a semantic definition. And it says that at psychological level, there is deterioration of well-being, and this implies psychological or emotional exhaustion. We also identify deterioration of well-being and physical level with physical exhaustion. And at the behavioral level, we did not identify any symptoms which occurs more than 7 times. However, in 10 out of 11 definitions, it was precise that the symptoms were related to workplace. So what can we do with a definition like this? Nothing, except having a good understanding of what it should contain. But to operate it as a definition in research and in practice, of course, we needed to translate it using the clinical terms. And for this, there is a very, very good resource. Unfortunately, not everyone is familiar with this resource. So this is the occasion to learn. And this resource is called SNOMED-CT, or Systematized Nomenclature of Medicine Clinical Terms. Actually, it is the Bible of the medical terminology. It's the most complete controlled vocabulary of medical terms. And it is updated. It is international, and it is much more used than ICD. For coding, for insurance reasons, for medical statistics, it's really the Bible in medicine. So I make its promotion because unfortunately I discovered that it is not used sufficiently in the research. And we used the last release at the moment of the study, which was July 2019. And as you can see in this nomenclature, burnout was already defined. It was defined as an anxiety disorder. It already had its ID number as the medical term. And as you can see in this nomenclature, there is a fully specified name, which is physical and emotional exhaustion state. It says that it is a disorder. And here I reported what is a disorder. Actually, it is a disease. And it can also have some acceptable synonyms. So burnout is an acceptable synonym for physical and emotional exhaustion state. And disorder and syndrome are actually acceptable symptoms for the disease. So don't fall in the trap of saying that it is a secondary diagnosis because it's not a disease, it is a syndrome. For SNOMED, it's just an acceptable synonym. So we use this terminology just to show you that there is also the definition of what is exhaustion, and it is classified as finding, which means that it is a discovery based on the clinical exam. It has different descriptors as a definition and as an interpretation. And it also has some hyponym concepts, because we can also consider that exhaustion could be due to the exposure, again as finding, which means that it is discovered during the clinical exam using an anamnesis or some additional investigations. So with this in mind, we proposed a definition statement using clinical precise terminology that we submitted to the Delphi panel for the approval. And to construct the Delphi panel, we asked the country representatives to try to find clinicians experienced with occupational burnout. And as you can see, we had quite a good percentage of occupational physicians participating to the study. Almost a half had more than 20 years of experience, and again, almost a half had a clinical practice as source of their expertise on burnout. So this Delphi panel remained stable during the first and the second round of the Delphi process. And at the second round, as you can see, the majority voted more than 7, which was also the a priori defined cutoff for the Delphi validation. So we got the consensus using Delphi method on the definition, which is stated here. In a worker, occupational burnout is an exhaustion due to prolonged exposure to work related to problems. So you see that the preferred term according to SNOMED-CT will be occupational, physical, and emotional exhaustion state instead of occupational burnout. And you find again here exhaustion due to prolonged exposure to work-related problems. So it is a conditional definition because it implies the condition that we will find this finding in worker and not in every population. And it is an operational definition because it requests the physician operates an anamnesis and investigation to establish the work-relatedness. So it was published in Scandinavian Journal, and I provided this publication if you want to read it more in detail. Our second study was dedicated to the burnout measures. And as you saw, it's very important to have a good measure. So we wanted to know how valid are the measures proposed for measuring burnout. And as you know, in the clinics, in medicine, we are very attentive to the diagnostic accuracy of the test that we will use to make a diagnosis, and 2 criteria for this are sensitivity and specificity. But when we are working with subjective measures, it becomes much more complicated because we need to assess the psychometric properties and psychometric validity of the tools. And to do it, there are much more criteria to be considered, like translational validity, face validity, content validity, and many other stuff. And as epidemiologists in medical research, we are not familiar on how to interpret these results, how to analyze them. So before starting, we conducted a work to create the methodological framework. And thanks to this framework, we could systematically assess different tools proposed for measuring burnout. So this is openly available in medRxiv, and you can use it for every psychometric analysis that you would need to do. And it presents the definition of every psychometric property, the analysis that you could apply to do it, and how to interpret the indices and results from this analysis. So again, we conducted the literature search to identify the published validation studies for 5 burnout tools, which were considered as validated. And we wanted quantitative results on adult workers with sample size more than 100 participants. As you can see, we had a lot of items in the beginning, but ended up with only 19 studies that we included. And here I displayed I displayed the tool, these 5 validated burnout measures. The first that you could already recognize is Maslach burnout inventory, the most used one. The second is PINE, published at the same year. And actually the two authors worked together but provided different tools. PBI Psychology Burnout Inventory, published several years later, Oldenburg Burnout Inventory, and finally Copenhagen Burnout Inventory, CBI, which was the last published tool at that moment. As you can see, we consider the original versions. We had 3 of them in English, 1 in German, and the 5th on Dutch. And of course, the most studies among the 19 studies identified concerned the validity of Maslach burnout inventory. So as you can see, the tools are very different. They have different dimensions. They have different number of items. So we really needed something, a good methodology to compare them systematically. And to do it, so we used our framework. And as you can see, we focused on 11 psychometric properties, which are cited here, including exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis. And the first criteria to judge on the validity was to consider the completeness of the psychometric validation process. And as you can see, MBI was finally quite a complete in terms of assessment, but not completely complete because there are still these empty cases, and it was much more the case for the other tools. So as you can see, none of the tools actually validated their content in terms of I mean, a serious validation studies. So it was the same for all the tools, and none of them assessed the sensitivity. And for this, there is a very good reason that we have no diagnostic standard. So I except the using Bayesian framework for assessing it, it was not possible to have the results on the sensitivity. So when we looked in details on the results of the different studies, we actually used our framework to correctly interpret the results. And as you can see, for the studies on Maslach burnout inventory, only on half of the results we had the complete agreement. And actually, it was the worst tool in terms of interpretation because, okay, for some proportion we had partial agreement, but for quite a large proportion we had a complete disagreement on the interpretation of results. It was very often over-interpreted in terms of validity. And to complete this assessment, we also used the guidelines provided by Cosmin Group, which are much more focusing on content validity, for which for them it is the most important psychometric property for every patient-reported outcome. So we did ourselves the content validity for every tool. And as you can see, the best results were reached for Copenhagen Burnout Inventory, CBI, and we found a moderate quality of evidence for the content validity. For Olby, it was the second best, but for the 3 other tools, it was very low. So we processed with all the other criteria, and we concluded that the first tool that we could recommend as, I will not say the best, but the less worse is CBI, followed by OLB. So this was the second study, and the third one was dedicated to the factors which contribute to the onset of burnout among workers. We were very many to work on this study, as you can see the participants listed here, and the idea was to identify causal predictors of burnout, sort them by type or family, and grade the evidence to help the decision on the work-relatedness of burnout cases when we do the individual assessment. So again, it was the systematic review, and we included original longitudinal studies published up to November 2018. And finally, 85 studies were included in the qualitative and quantitative synthesis. And we actually characterized the effect size and direction in this study, used the MOVEREC tool for risk of bias assessment and the GRADE guidelines for the quality assessment, overall evidence assessment. As you can see, among the 248 studies identified and then included 85 included in quantitative analysis, we identified a very large number of predictors, 261 predictors analyzed. And the biggest family was that of situational and work-related factors. Actually, 145 predictors were sorted in this family. The second biggest family was individual factors, including personality traits, job attitudes, some personal events like leisure or stressful life events. The third one, work-related interface with work-family conflicts or family-work conflicts or enrichment, so two directions possible. And finally, some perceived intermediate work consequences as stress or satisfaction. And of course, we already applied the harmonized approach because we focused on exhaustion in this systematic review as the main or core dimension of burnout. And here you can see the results. So we have only moderate, low, or very low evidence for some of these predictors. As you can see, leisure and negative attitudes, which are mostly individual, predictors have moderate evidence but with small or medium-sized effects. Leisure is protective against burnout, together with adaptive coping at work, and the negative job attitudes is a harmful predictor, together with quantitative demands and job demands at work, and also this intermediate stress from work conditions. So just to close this discussion and to come back to the first analysis provided by Heinemann, Linda, and Thorsten, you can see that even if we had the largest number of publications dedicated to the studies of causes and associated factors of burnout, we still have quite a low evidence among this research, which again confirmed the necessity to harmonize the approaches in the research. So our next steps are to promote the harmonized definition, to test it in a broader panel in different countries, abroad the European Union, also to conduct qualitative and quantitative research among outpatients treated for their burnout, also among healthcare who take care of these patients. And of course, the goal, the principal goal now is to define clinical diagnosis criteria and clinical cutoff values for the most valid patient-reported outcome measures. There is a great need to understand the mechanism of the burnout development and its biological and clinical nature. And for this, we can use biomarkers and clinical research and molecular research. And of course, in the meantime, we should prevent it as much as possible. So to finish, I would like to acknowledge the help and contribution of my students, who were many of the OmegaNet cost action and particularly the working group burnout. And of course, thank you for your attention.